my name is Michaël Green, and I welcome you to the 11th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Professor Mette Birkedal Bruun from the University of Copenhagen. Mette is director of the Center for Privacy Studies and is a church historian. She worked extensively on the Cistercians in the Middle Ages and in the early modern time. In recent years, she moved into the study of early modern privacy. And today, in my conversation with her, I will be asking her about the motivations to study history, the motivations to continue academic career, and the way that she crafted her own niche within the academia. I welcome Mette to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Mette. Welcome to my podcast. I'm very happy to talk to you again. And just for our listeners, I would like to say that Mette and I worked together at the Center for Privacy Studies for 3 years. And Mette was and still is the director of the center, where I was at the time postdoctoral researcher. So welcome, Mette. And
thank you so much.
I usually start my podcast by asking the guest questions about his or her childhood, and I would like to ask you about yours. Could you tell a little bit, where do you come from? What is your family background? Where were you born? Where did you go to school?
Yes, I was born in Copenhagen, and then my parents moved to Sorø, which is a small provincial town on the island of Zealand in Denmark. It's an hour from Copenhagen, and I grew up there. It's a town that was created around a Cistercian monastery, actually. I don't think that has anything to do with the fact that I later became a specialist of the Cistercians, but who knows? So I grew up there. It was a very sort of safe childhood, and with close friends, close neighbors, a school close by. So it was a small community. My father was an architect. My mother was a physiotherapist. It was a home with a lot of books and a lot of cultural baggage, you may say. So all our holidays, almost always had a component of going to museums or visiting churches or visiting old castles. So in that sense, there was plenty of history in growing up. And my grandfather used to tell us a lot of sort of Nordic mythology and old stories and legends. So also there was a lot of history. I used to read a lot of Prince Valiant comic books, and also there was a lot of history. So I had a lot of history in my childhood, but it was in a very sort of particular kind of narrative form. And I think for my own interest, it was a little bit a romantic interest in history. I used to read historical novels for children, so about heroes and heroines in history, and that spoke to me a lot. So it was very much sort of a romantic approach, I'd say.
And could you cite some of the books that you read as a child, except of the comics?
Well, there was some Danish books. So there was a Danish female author who had made it her specialty, and they were old, I think, already when I read them. But to write novels about Danish female figures, so that would be Danish queens, for instance, or other kind of female figures in Danish history. And I think she would often embellish a lot on the history, so it was by no means historically correct. But that certainly sort of kindled my historical imagination, you may say.
You know, when I hear you speaking about it, I think about myself, and I really liked reading historical novels myself as a child. I still love it, I must admit. And for me, Dumas was one of those books that was really fascinating. And I wonder, did you have access also to foreign literature as a child? To Dumas,
Dumas, definitely. Jules Verne as well was a huge thing for me. Yeah, definitely. So all these good sort of cloak and dagger, that was a very good thing for me.
So when you went to school, could you choose already a direction at school? Which topics could you follow? For example, in Israel, we could follow a specific program of humanities. So that I was doing the humanistic studies. I know that in some other countries, there's no such options, and you just have a set program. So I wonder, how did it work in Denmark?
No, when we came to the Danish gymnasium, so the high school system, you could choose at that point between an overall humanities direction or an overall natural science direction, and within each of those you had different branches. And I chose the modern language side in the humanities, so that meant Latin actually, but and English and French. So that was and German. So that was my direction. And looking back, I can see that also there, so history was compulsory for both branches. But I definitely, whenever doing written assignments or doing anything else where I could choose my own topic, I would always veer towards a historical dimension, I think.
And I wonder, when was the first time that you realized that history is something interesting, and maybe interesting even beyond the stories? But when was this moment that you realized, oh, history, it's something that sounds cool?
I think so. I think for my childhood, I always liked history, but I did not necessarily connect it to a career. So I was. It took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to study, but for the longest time, I thought I was going to be a journalist. So history was not necessarily my first choice of topic. So I think for me it was much more, again, the romantic side, the entertainment, the sort of the deep myth, and so much more than a career possibility.
And then you slowly progressed through the school years, and
Yes.
you ended up finishing high school. And then you had the choice of where to study, what to study, and maybe if to study at all. And here, before you answer, I want to say that I spoke to several people already in this podcast, and some of them said that for women in the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s in Scandinavia, but also in other parts of Europe, sometimes it was not such an obvious choice as it might seem to us nowadays, that we encourage, of course, everyone to study. And could you maybe say a little bit about that part too?
Well, that's interesting. As I said, I came from a home where there were a lot of books, and I think it was also always understood that I would probably do some kind of higher education. Journalism in Denmark at that point was not a higher education, but still, and that was for the longest time sort of my set choice. I did an internship in school at the Danish national television, and went with a journalist to the government, and saw how they interviewed people, and so I was quite committed to that career. But then suddenly I realized that it would be the fewest journalists who would actually go to national television, and most of them would end up in local newspapers. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but that was a completely different ball game. And so I got a little sort of homeless in my wishes. When I graduated from high school, I actually didn't know what I was going to study. I got a job at a publisher, a small publisher who printed his own books, and I thought I might go in that direction because I was interested in literature as well. But then I had a good friend who studied theology. And I should say that my grandfather was a minister in the Danish church. So the whole theological sort of component, not necessarily as a profoundly religious dimension, but as a cultural dimension, had very much been part of my upbringing. So we would go to church for Easter and for Christmas and sort of once in a while. But for me, it was mostly the hymns and the buildings and the whole historical baggage. But I thought theology sounded very interesting because it had both the philosophical component, all the languages. So in Denmark, we study Hebrew and ancient Greek and Latin to do theology. And then, of course, history. So while I was a year at the publisher after high school, I took Greek classes, and then I began studying theology and never looked back. It was the most amazing education ever.
And I wonder, you moved from the village that you lived, or a town that you lived in Zealand, to the big city. How was it?
I
How was it
loved
for
it.
you to move from the small place back to the capital?
Yeah, I loved it. It was just, I felt at home. It was difficult to bike there. I would constantly jump to the pavement with my bike because I got caught in the traffic, so that was a little daunting. But otherwise, it was amazing to come to the big city and again actually have the history sort of in all the streets, and yeah, that was very good.
So then you started theology, and you finished a master's degree in theology.
I did.
But for PhD, you decided to go for church history rather than theology. And I wonder why. Why didn't you become a
I did my
theologian?
master thesis in theology. I did that in a very, very odd topic in a way. I'd always been a little bit on the side. So while I was studying theology, I took courses in medieval music and medieval literature in other departments. And I did my master thesis on the medieval French Grails novel. So there is Prince Valiant again. And then I did a comparison with the medieval Grail novel and the Cistercian sort of mindset. And I think I sort of showed that there was a possibility that there was some kind of Cistercian influence on that particular Grail novel. And so it was in a way, I lived my old dream of this, this sort of mythic and legendary history. And then, so through the Arthurian romances and the whole Grail story, I came actually to the monks. And then when I wanted to do my PhD, at first I thought I was going to continue with the Grail and have a broader perspective on medieval theology through Grail stories. But then I chose the monks. And that was a nice choice.
And for PhD, you actually left Copenhagen and went to Aarhus.
I did. And it seemed that there were not so many opportunities to do a PhD for me in Copenhagen. I had some very, very strong colleagues there who were also applying for PhD. So I thought, well, let's try something else. At that point, Aarhus may not seem like a very daunting thing. It's 3.5 hours from Copenhagen by train. But for us, I had a child at that point. I was expecting my second child. It was actually a big move because we had no friends in Aarhus and no relatives in Aarhus. So it seemed like quite a leap.
Well, the podcast is addressing not only established historians, but also those who might think about doing a PhD in history, masters in history. How did you choose the supervisor? What was the important thing in that choice? Because PhD supervisor is someone who either guides you through or ensures that you don't go through.
So I chose a supervisor who was sort of the great old church historian of Aarhus. And he retired 2 years into my PhD. And then I got a new supervisor who was a woman who was not in the same department. She was working on Bernard of Clairvaux as I was, but from another angle. So the first supervisor, the first choice of supervisor was very obvious because he was simply the big star in the department. I was very afraid of him.
What was his name?
Jakob Balling.
And
he died some years ago, and he was a huge figure. He welcomed me very, very cordially, but I never became very close with him because then I had maternity leave, and then I went to Cambridge for a year, and then he retired, and then the new supervisor took over. So I wasn't. It was not a very close supervisor relationship.
And the second supervisor, what was her name?
Else Marie Wiberg Petersen, who is a very strong Bernard scholar, but somebody who works in systematic theology. So she is not a historian, and that also meant that she was a very supportive supervisor. But it also meant that in terms of historical approaches to the Cistercians, I had to find my own way. So I want to say that also in this podcast, that sometimes having to find your own way may feel like a very lonesome thing, but it can also be very, very good because it makes you very independent and very scholarly autonomous.
Then I wonder, because you had different approaches to what you were doing, Did it cause any tensions? And if so, then how did you overcome those tensions? If your supervisor, for example, was trying to push you in the direction of more systematic theology and you were more interested in history, how did you navigate?
To be honest, I think I was fiercely independent in so many ways, and I think, to be honest, she gave up a little bit on me because she felt that I was not someone who was easily supervised, I think. So as again, I will say it's because I was always in my PhD, I was always in between literary historians and historians and church historians. So I was sort of at the interface between different disciplines, and I didn't feel super at home in any of these fields. So I was constantly a little bit on the margins, and that also meant that I had nobody. To be honest, I didn't have many idols to look to. Then at some point, when I was in Cambridge, there was a professor in Cambridge who recommended. So everybody has been extremely helpful, and professors in Cambridge, they welcomed me. Nobody understood what I was doing, but they were very helpful. So that's a nice thing, right? And somebody recommended a book by a church historian in Amsterdam. And I thought, oh, I don't want to read any more books about Bernard of Clairvaux, who was my topic, because there are so many books out there about Bernard of Clairvaux. But eventually I read this book, and it was more literary in character than any other book on Bernard I had read. And I got so inspired. And then I wrote to him, I was so inspired by your book. And he wrote back, he was very, very kind. And we're still in close contact, actually. He wrote back, then you must be the reader I wrote it for, which was just the most generous thing that anybody has ever said to me. And then I went to Amsterdam to visit him, and he read through my whole PhD dissertation, and it was 3 months before I was submitting, and he said, well, you can submit, don't worry, you're going to be fine. So that meant a lot for me, it meant a lot to me that he sort of, he was willing to engage in that sort of relationship, that scholarly relationship. And we have kept in touch ever since. So that was in 2000, and we are still writing Christmas cards.
And who was that?
He's called Bjørn Pranger, and he retired a few years ago. And has worked on Augustine and Bernard and Anselm, so the big sort of churches, early church historical figures.
I think you brought a very important point here about the relationship with the supervisor, and also the other options that a person has. And it doesn't really matter if in academic work as a postdoc or as a PhD student, as a master student, that the supervisor is not the only person who can make an important impact on what we are doing as researchers. So I think that it was a very good illustration of that. And I wonder, how did you go to Cambridge? What led you to Cambridge?
So I was actually thinking about Warwick, because there was a professor there who was closer to my field. But then I thought, well, Cambridge is a big place, not quantitatively, but qualitatively a big place. And I thought it would be an amazing opportunity to see it from the inside. And then there was a fellowship program that meant that there were a few colleagues in Aarhus who had been there before. So I had they helped me and they guided me as to how to get in touch with the colleges. And that is a very overwhelming thing, I must say, to get in touch with a new academic system. And again, for the sake of the podcast, I really, really encourage people to do it, and to have a little bit of courage, and also have a little bit of confidence in getting in touch with people, and simply finding their way into a new academic system, and ask other people for guidance, and ask other people for help, because it can seem very, very daunting. For me, it was wonderful. I spent most of the time at the library, and then in conversation at the college. I was at Clare Hall College, which is a graduate college, and there my closest colleague, not in terms of discipline, but in terms of interactions, was a female professor from the States who was an expert in early Chinese history. So we would meet, once a week or once every second week, and talk about, what did you read last week? And she was being extremely supportive. And for me, it was actually not a problem that she was in an entirely different field, because her ability to listen and her ability to ask good questions was extreme. So that was actually for me the most helpful, because as again I was pretty scholarly independent, so I wasn't necessarily in need of deep scholarly supervision, but I was in need of exchanges, I was in need of reflections and getting help to find my own way, I think.
I think it brings an important point, the academic loneliness. And when you move into this new environment, and sometimes even when you're in your own environment as an academic, you can feel very lonely because there are no people who are dealing with your subject. And it's one of the ways that you can deal with, of course, is try to find someone to talk to. But I wonder, socially, when you moved to Cambridge, how did you deal with the social environment that you, I don't know if you moved with your family for that year or you
Well,
moved
I
alone?
was very lucky because I had a daughter who went to nursery school, and then I had a young son. And when you have children, you enter into a different kind of sort of social setting, because you meet other parents in the nursery school or at the playground, and so that was not so much a problem, the sort of social environment. But I must say the scholarly loneliness, that's a thing I definitely recognize. And there I would. I mean, so one of my most formative experiences have been to go to the International Medieval Congress in Leeds, which is every year, which is the biggest European medieval congress. And back then it had around 1,200 participants. I think it has even more now. And to stand there in the dining hall with your morning breakfast tray and 1,200 people almost, and think, I don't know a soul, where am I going to put myself and a tray? And then actually just sit down next to a stranger and say, who are you? Because that's the thing about such conferences, right? That people are normally willing and ready to actually engage in conversations. So again, to strike up conversations with strangers, that has actually been, for me, a way out in many different contexts, both at conferences and, as I said, writing to this professor in Amsterdam, who actually put me in touch with one of his old students who was also doing a PhD on Bernard of Clairvaux, who's a Belgian. So we weren't close in sort of geographically, but we were on the same topic. And also there, I struck up a really, really profound academic friendship, and we have stayed in touch ever since. So again, these sort of just simply hooking up with people and not waiting for people to carry you into a social environment, but actually try to sort of just latch onto people and say, do you want to talk with me? I think it is a very difficult thing to do, but it's very rewarding. And I must also say, as a professor, so I have had PhD students contacting me and saying, it's always nice with a bit of flattery, right? So say, I read your article on this and that. Would you be willing to, for me to come and visit you for an afternoon and tell you about my work? Or would you be willing to read some of my work? And that is always, for me, it's a pleasure when people do that. And I'm very busy, and sometimes I have more time and sometimes I have less time, but I would never, I think, reject people who did that. So I think that might be a lesson for also young scholars to actually dare to do that.
I recognize what you say because I had a very similar experience when I was just beginning my PhD studies many years ago already. I went with a colleague from the Netherlands to a conference in England, and we ended up after dinner. I was standing there looking at people, and I was too shy to approach them. And this colleague of mine, he met all of the important professors. He told them that he read their article, just as you mentioned, and that it was fascinating. And he managed to get those connections very fast. And I think that for me, it was also a very important lesson, how you should do it.
I will also give another piece of advice, which is something that I've learned in the beginning, for instance, at Leeds, where I was sitting next to these big professors, and I was so worried. I was thinking, oh my God, I'll come across as completely ignorant. But then I discovered that in order to point the focus away from myself, I could just ask them questions, which has a double benefit. On the one hand, everybody likes to talk about themselves, right? So it makes for a nice conversation, but you also learn a lot by asking other people questions. So that's also a strategy that I will actually recommend, to ask questions rather than think, oh, what can I say that makes me look clever, or so because everybody likes to be asked sort of scholarly questions along the lines of what you're doing right in this podcast. So how did you begin? How was your interest in history kindled? Or how did you think about the topic of your first book, or things like that? And that's something you can always ask also as a PhD student to a professor, I think.
And I think it brings me to my rather private question. You were a mother with 2 children, a husband. You were doing a full-time PhD study and also traveled abroad. And I wonder, how did you manage to do all of this? Because it, of course, takes a lot of energy to deal with a lot of things. And we are all aware that for some women, it is maybe a disadvantage that they have because they have less time to dedicate.
I think for me, it was a great luck that my husband, then husband, now ex-husband, was doing the same thing. So we were doing PhDs at the same time, which was in many ways difficult because we were very, very stressed at the same time, but it also meant that we had equally important careers, and we didn't have to negotiate, who has a more important career. I think often when it becomes problematic for one spouse or the other, one partner or the other, it's because they have to constantly negotiate, well, is my career more important than yours? Or is today, when our child is sick, is it more important that I get to work than you get to work? So we had an ongoing negotiation. Well, I work today, you work tomorrow. I go to this conference, you go to that conference. So that was a great luck for me, I think.
And then you were finishing the PhD, and I wonder at what stage you realized that it's something that you want to do for a career. Not just out of curiosity, not just out of passion for the monks, not out of passion for Bernard of Clairvaux, but
not even.
but for the sake of continuing doing it and also earning money and building yourself as an academic.
Well, I can't put the exact date, but I can put the exact moment. And that was when I was doing my master thesis. So that was before my PhD. And someday my supervisor, my master supervisor, said, well, have you ever considered doing a PhD? And when I was in high school, I got very high grades and I did very well. But at university, I have gotten very good grades, but not excellent grades. And it has never occurred to me that I could do a PhD, that I would be somebody who would be PhD material. So the fact that he said that to me, that was actually, it's apart from the birth of my children, that is one of the most happy days in my life. And I think it's, to be honest, you have touched upon the gender perspective before. I think there is something gendered there, that some women have to have other people tell them that they are PhD material because they cannot imagine that themselves. And I think that's actually, and I think that's still the case. This was in 1995. But I still see among the students that it's my students, it's much easier for the male students to say, well, I think I want an academic career, than for the female students. And that may have to do with a lot of different things, insecurities and wanting a family and thus not wanting, the sort of precarious employments and so on. But it may also have to do with actually the ability to see yourself as, for instance, PhD material. But when he asked that, I said, yes, I want a PhD. I want, from that point on, I knew that being an associate professor of church history at the University of Copenhagen was my big dream. And then I went to Aarhus. So I had this notion, well, in order to reach that goal, I need to perhaps go to Aarhus to get a PhD. So there is both that to have the goal, but also understand that the path ahead may not be straight.
How did your environment accept your new decision?
Ha! Well, actually, and that was the thing. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, but that was much earlier. But that might be interesting as well. They were so disappointed that I decided to study theology because they wanted to see me as a literary journalist, and they had once known a vicar in a church minister who was awful, and they thought, "Oh my God!" And they even said to me, do you really want to study theology now that you know that it's a disappointment to us? So just because there might be, other cases where studying theology would be considered the best thing and going for journalism would be the second best. But in my case, it was actually the other way around. Otherwise, I think in my sort of family and surroundings, it was welcome. My younger brother did a PhD as well, but in engineering, and his wife has a PhD as well. So it was not something. I mean, neither of my parents have been scholars, but it didn't seem very odd. So I didn't face any opposition there, I think.
And your husband or boyfriend, I think at the time you were already.
Well, in the beginning, it worked very well because we were doing the same thing. I must say, eventually it became difficult that we were doing the same thing because it becomes the comparison is very. It's very easy to make comparisons. So it became a little difficult that I, in a way, had more support from the institution that he had, and that became a matter of contention between us, and also a matter of what do you say, competition, to be honest. So
And then you finished your PhD, or you were about to finish your PhD, and you had the goal that you wanted to achieve to get this associate professorship.
exactly.
Just maybe we should make a little remark that in Denmark you don't really have assistant professorship as a permanent position, but associate professorship. So how did you plan and build your career path to actually get to that goal? Because I think that's the most important step.
Yeah. So I think back then things were still a little more easy than they are today, because back then there was a sense that it was last person standing. And if you had enough perseverance and enough stamina, there might eventually be a position. No, I mean, if you were good. So it's not that people would have a position if they were not good, but it was very much a matter of grit and just sticking to it. I got my first permanent position when I was above 40. So I had a lot of temporary postdoctoral positions, which seen in hindsight wasn't as precarious as it sounds, but of course, it was still 2 years, 3 years, 2 more years. So yeah. But I got a postdoc from the Danish Research Council to do a 2-year research project at the University of Copenhagen. And then I got an employment at a center of excellence at the University of Copenhagen. And I learned afterwards that there were people who had supported my entry into that center very sort of wholeheartedly, and I didn't realize that at the time. So that's also another thing to pass on, that sometimes you have supporters and you don't know it. So you may feel very lonely, and you may feel that it's all up to you, but sometimes there are good people who actually mentor you behind the screens and want you to succeed. And I was lucky in that respect.
In Denmark, there is still the idea of habilitation, which is no longer compulsory, but 17 years passed between your PhD, which you finished in 2000, and the habilitation. What encouraged you to make habilitation, because it's no longer compulsory?
I think that's also a gender thing, and I think that was because I didn't want anybody to think that I hadn't deserved to be where I was. So I did a habile, which was not only a habile, but was also a habile of 820 pages, which is a lot in Denmark. I know that sometimes the other countries, I know Germany has very long PhDs as well, and France also, but so for us it's a little different. But 820 pages, that's a lot. And that was also too much in a way. And I didn't spend 17 years every day, but because I published a book in the meantime about burnout, but I spent a lot of time on that habile. And yeah, so, and I think that's really about the need, or the feeling of a need to prove myself. I also liked doing the Habile. That was another monk, but here we are in the 17th century. So that is exactly Dumas. And I think there was something the sort of the Three Musketeers period about that as well. I say something about that actually, because I did my PhD on Bernard, so that is the medieval Cistercian movement, and I was actually thinking that I would continue in that track. But then when I got the employment at the Center of Excellence, they asked, would you be willing to do something related to the cultural heritage of medieval rituals, which was the topic of the center? And I thought, well, then I have to move up in time. And I had always been in the Middle Ages. I'd always that was my main focus. But then I moved up in time and saw that there was a Cistercian reform in the 17th century that might be relevant. And I knew nothing about the 17th century. And this was these were French sources. I had my school French, but I didn't have any sort of particular French. And then I thought, well, I'm going to do this. So I changed. So it was still Cistercians, but it was a completely different period, a completely different mindset, a completely different worldview. And that is also a piece of advice that I might pass on. And it may not be equally relevant in all contexts, but in my context, at least, both when I was a young scholar and now when I hire young scholars, I'd say that flexibility and scholarly pliancy is a very, very good thing. It also has to do with scholarly confidence to say, well, I'm not staying necessarily within my track, but I'm able to move in different directions should opportunities occur.
I think that's a very good piece of advice. And I myself, when I was hired for Center for Privacy Studies, I also moved away from my beloved Huguenot studies topic into the field of privacy studies. And I must say that I enjoy it very much still. And I still continue for the time being doing this privacy research because I find it very stimulating. But I think that if I did not get into the center, most likely I would have done probably something else. You not only became a permanent employee of the university, you also managed to receive quite a large number of grants, of important grants. And I think this is something that would be interesting to talk about, because you had an ERC, and then you received this major grant of the Danish National Research Foundation for the Center for Privacy Studies. And well, I guess from that point on, it was much easier to get grants than before. But perhaps you could tell a little bit about the process of getting those the first big grants. Well, what did it take from you as a person?
Well, first of all, I have world record in rejections, and I still have a lot of rejections, and that is important. We don't talk so much about rejections, but they are always, also for people who on the outside look very fortunate, such as myself, they are also always part and parcel of academic life for all of us. And I think that's very important to say. So when I got my ERC consolidator, I had 17 rejections from all the funds you can imagine. Danish and international. I had also had one rejection from ERC before. I had a rejection from the Danish National Research Foundation, European Science Foundation, Danish Research Council, you name them. And I think that's a very important message. And I think what it took for me was to keep at it. And that is very difficult when you keep being rejected, to sort of submit again. I once met a person from the Danish Research Council, and she said, "Oh, it's so nice to see you in person finally. Now we have seen applications from you each year," and they all got rejections. So that was in a way a very humiliating moment for me. But at the same time, she was very kind. She meant well, and I think you have to be willing and able and again, brave enough to put yourself out there, because it's very, very easy to avoid rejections. You just need to avoid doing applications, right?
So, exactly. Yeah. And I know quite a few people who follow this
exactly
path.
Exactly. So I think there is something. So that's the one thing. The other thing, and that may sound ridiculous, for all of these 17 applications, I was more or less sort of rehashing the same project. So in different dimensions, with different teams, with different sort of priorities. And the reviewers kept saying, well, it's a very nice idea, but we don't get the coherence of the project. And eventually I thought, I don't want that kind of criticism again. So now I'm going to make a coherent project. And so and it took me a while to understand that the reviewers were actually not simply stupid and not simply out to get me, but that they might actually have a point. So listening, and I mean, being very careful about, do the reviewers have anything useful to say? It may also be that they haven't. So I'm not saying take everything they say completely seriously, but just to see, well, is there a message here that I can actually learn from? And then I spent 1 year working on my consolidator application. So that's also another. I've heard other people who do it in an afternoon, and I don't know. I have never, the big grants I've had, I have worked like a mad person to get them. It has been a lot of work, a lot of effort. So just to say, in my experience, and it may be different for other scholars, but there are no shortcuts to big grants.
Thank you very much for this.
I don't know.
You also raised here another important point of rejections, and in particular of academic rejections.
Yes.
How do you deal with rejections? Well, you mentioned about projects, which is a big thing, but I think a lot of people deal on ongoing basis with the rejections of their publications in journals, in book chapters, their books. I know people who went through a lot of those rejections, and some of them never actually managed to have the stamina to publish something big or in a big journal. What was your way of dealing with this? You mentioned that you kept on trying, but there's a sense of rejection that someone tells you, well, sorry, but you're not good enough. Or
no, that's awful. That's always awful. And when I get those rejections, I always want to dig a big hole and jump into it and never get out again, and never have to show my face to anybody again. So I'm not taking rejection lightly. I will say. I mean, it's very difficult for me to get rejections. I mean, it taps into all my insecurities every time, and it still does. So I think the most important thing, and for me, I cannot see that when I get my rejection, but perhaps a few days later or a few weeks later, the most important thing is to see that it's not about you as a person, it's about that product. So it's not about changing who you are as a person or even as a scholar, but about a particular product that has been rejected. So that might be an application or an article or a book chapter or whatever. And I think, first of all, try to isolate it there. Then again, here, try to understand whether anything has been, whether there is anything to learn in the process. And sometimes there is nothing to learn in the process other than some kind of misanthropic sort of, oh my God, the world sucks, and now it's proven right. But sometimes there are little points, either about the reviewers actually having a point, or you having been unclear in an application, for instance, or you having missed something, or so try to reach that point where you're actually able to discuss with the review you've had and the feedback you've had. I don't think it's easy, and it doesn't become easier for me. So I think that when we say stamina, it feels like, well, that's just about pulling yourself together. Stamina in my experience is really a hardcore discipline, because it's you really have to get yourself up again and to pull yourself, for me, as I said, pull yourself out of that deep black hole, pull yourself out of all these insecurities and get out there again. It's very difficult.
Now you're at the peak of your career, I would say, being director of the center, and not one but several of them, and being professor of church history in Copenhagen. But then my question is, what's next? How do you see your professional future for the next 10, 15 years? Because now it's really a peak, and after a peak, it might go a little bit, it might slow down if you choose, or you might want to continue staying or actually going further. So the question is, what do you plan? Well, you don't of course need to tell me exact details, because there is a belief that if you say too much, then you don't get it. So let's make it very general.
Well, it's a very, very good question, and it's one that I ask myself almost every day. I'm 55, so as you say, 15 years. I mean, how do I want to spend the rest of my career? Um, it's not so simple for me. I'm a member of the board of the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, and I have a few sort of investments there in research policy and some more overall sort of perspectives to do with research in Denmark. I'm very concerned about the role in humanities, both at the university and in society. I'm also a member of the Danish Council for Research and Innovation Policy, which is a council under the Danish Ministry for Research, which deals with everything to do with research and innovation. So there I'm right now in a working group on innovation, which is about how do small businesses make use of research. And that's not theological research, I'd say. So I'm trying to broaden my horizon and trying to understand more about the research landscape and what can humanities do. I think it's extremely important for the humanities to become much clearer about their own potential role in, say, green transition or other kinds of big societal challenges. And I think that, so I see myself right now in these different contexts a little bit like a mediator, so a mediator between scholars and perhaps the political system, and that goes both ways, because it's also a matter of conveying to scholars what can you do to show your own relevance. And I don't know, I might want to do more of that. It's not that I don't enjoy scholarship, but there are a lot of good scholars out there. But in these different boards, I have a position that is not often held by a theologian or a person from the humanities. So I think that's important, right?
What would be the most important lesson that you learned from your own research as a historian, theologian?
I think it is the relevance of historical research. And I think not only historical research as, well, if we know what happened in the past, we will know what happens in the future. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that's a very sort of schematic way of thinking. But I think history helps us to ask questions of the present. So since I'm a historian of religious cultures and a church historian, I'm concerned with religious systems, belief systems, sort of religiously coded value systems. And that is a dimension that helps us to ask questions as to value systems today. So you and I both work on privacy, and when we work on early modern privacy, it's easy to see that, well, they were very religious, they were very interested in being alone with God, so they would withdraw in privacy, blah blah blah, and that's very interesting from a scholarly perspective. When we talk with people who work on privacy today, that prompts the question, well, what do we believe in today when we want to be private? And that might not be something religious, but it could be a belief in personal autonomy or in personal freedom or in human rights, and it helps us to foreground our belief systems. And I think history is extremely important there, and I think we as historians have a lot to contribute, actually, to that kind of discussion. Also, questions to do with power, who has the power to define things. We always look at that historically, but we can equally ask those questions of today.
I have a proposition for you.
Yes.
I think that those ideas that you just mentioned, it's something that should be spread more globally beyond Denmark. And since you are very active, or rather active on Twitter and LinkedIn, perhaps you could make a quote of the month and put those ideas about the relevance of history out there for the broader public, academic, but also not academic, to see. Because I think it's very important for people, both who do historical research or humanities research, and those who are interested in it or those who are not, that they have an idea of how what you're doing is what the Dutch call societally relevant.
Exactly. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a very, very good idea.
I thank you very much for your time, and I hope that our listeners will enjoy our conversation.
So do I. Thank you.